Susie,
Rob.
today I wanted to chat to you about the origin of sexual reproductions. This is going to be a bit tricky to talk about without getting into lots of conversations about sex. How should we frame this for a family friendly audience?
Oh, I don't think we should bother with that. I think we should just talk about sex a lot, Rob. In fact, it might be the highlight of my day.
Right. I don't think this is the sort of erotic dreams we're talking about here. This is going to be
Oh,
very dry mathematical conversations about sex. Does that change your parameterization there?
yeah, I'm off. Bye.
Okay, so Susie, this week I'm going to talk to you about the origin of animals and the origins of different kinds of reproduction and the explosive diversity of origin of animals. So this is going to be a bit of a complicated paper, but before we get into that, I wanted to ask you, because we haven't met in a while. June was a busy week, busy month for the fossil files because we had lots of different bonus episodes in our month anniversary. But you and I haven't actually sat down for a while.
No, we
What have you been
haven't.
up to?
I have been away. I was at the European Association of Vertebrate Paleontology annual meeting in Lithuania, in Vilnius.
Fancy.
Yeah, it was excellent. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was really, really good. I had a lovely time. There were some great talks. There was some nice food. And sometimes I struggle with, Central European food because I don't love meat. It can be a
Hmm.
bit challenging, but actually, do you know, it was there's a hint of Scandi in there. So lots of
Yeah,
smoked salmon and potato kind of pancakes and stuff. It was very, very nice. Enjoyed the food.
lots of dumplings.
There were a few dumplings, but they were good dumplings. They had mushrooms in,
Hmm.
so therefore they're good.
Okay.
Um, got to hang out with some old friends, people like Jeff Liston, who's obviously always a good crack, and
Oh yeah.
also
Hmm.
made some new friends too. So yeah, all around
Oh,
had a
good.
lovely time. And next one's in Vienna this time next year, so I've got it in my diary already.
So you've come back all European and trendy.
Yeah, all European invertebrate paleontology.
Oh yeah. I, meanwhile, have been to Shropshire,
Oh
which
well,
is a
that's
much less
nice.
exciting destination. But we went to go and look at some fossil fish with two of my PhD students. That was fun.
Did
We're
you
going to
find
have a look
some?
at their little fossil collections.
Oh, you
Oh,
really
well, we went to the
collected?
museum collections, yeah. Yeah, we've been digging up things in Shropshire before, but this time it was going to see what's already been dug up by other people. So that was fun.
Did you find some good stuff?
Yeah, well, some bits and pieces. There's some that our local collaborator Peter has asked us to look at. But it was a bit hot, and now I just have to. I don't know why this is relevant. I feel like the audience need to know. Today we're in heat wave number 3 of this summer in the UK, I think. But I think you're okay because you're in an air conditioned office. I'm melting.
I just had to put on a cardigan, everybody, because it's a bit chilly in my office. I did when it was 37 degrees and we had that heat wave a couple of weeks ago. I actually put on a pair of woolly socks in my office because it was really cold. It's just very
Oh my god.
drafty in the air conditioning. I'm not good with drafts.
Oh my god. So I need to go and hang out in the Natural Museum with you rather than absolutely cooking in Manchester. Okay,
Hmm.
so we need to get on with this week's paper. But before we do that, I want to shout out to our Patreon members who get access to all our bonus content. Thank you to them for their support. It means
How
a
many
lot.
Patreon
We've
members do
got
we have now?
I can't. It's not massive numbers, but it's nice of them to participate because you get access to the extra content.
Well, it's very
But particularly, I wanted
exclusive.
to call out. It's a very exclusive, exclusive club. But thanks to everybody that supports us.
Yeah. Thanks,
And check it
guys.
out if you want to earn access to the extra content, bonus content. Okay. Okay, so let's move on to this week's paper. So I have chosen this week's paper. I've gone further back in time than we ever have done before because I think looking at the responses from our listeners, people seem to like the older stuff. So we're going to go a bit older. But I've inadvertently picked what is perhaps the most complex paper we've ever done. So are we ready for some complexity?
Can I just say, so for
Hmm.
once, Rob, and thank you. I would like to say thank you for actually sending me the paper more than 35
Yes,
minutes in
yes.
advance today. Rob actually did send me this paper. I think 2 days ago, and I opened the link and I started reading. I read the abstract, and then I started reading it, and then I realised that I didn't know what about 90% of the words meant. And then I skipped a bit, and then I skipped a bit more, and I thought, well, there's no point reading the methods. So then I read the acknowledgement.
I think that's fair. That's fair. So we're going to get into some maths now.
Okay.
But don't worry, listeners. I've
Oh,
tried to
good.
break this down into a way that it's going to be understandable because ultimately, whilst this is a story about sex, it's also a story about maths. So
Statistics.
sex and maths, the two favourite things that people can talk about. Okay, this week's paper is The Influence of Reproductive Mode on Resource Competition and Diversity Patterns in Ediacaran Early Animal Communities. Ediacaran. I'm going to have to pick a lane.
I was going to say, can I stop you there? Is it Ediacaran or is it Ediacaran? But we don't mind, do we? We don't mind on this podcast.
We don't mind. We'll just have to ignore. I've heard it said both ways, and there might be people getting annoyed with me for saying it the wrong way. But it's from the Ediacara Hills in Australia, so I guess we should follow whatever they.
But how are they not Ediacaran Hills? I think what we need to do is we need Emily Mitchell. Emily Mitchell, if you listen to our podcast, can you please just send us a message on Blue Sky, send us a message somewhere, and just tell us how to pronounce Ediacaran /Ediacaran.
So Emily is the author of this paper, along with Andrea Manica.
I know.
It occurs to me we should have invited her on, I guess, because she's a friend of both of ours. We could have just had her on. Well, I guess that's not really what we do on Fossil Files very often, is it? But maybe we should do that more often.
Well, she could have explained her own paper to us then.
But then we can't be rude about it if we have her on. Not that I'm planning on being rude about it.
Are you going to be rude about it?
Anyways, this is Emily Mitchell and Andrea Manica from the University of Cambridge. So the University of Cambridge has got a long tradition of looking at Ediacaran things, especially with Emily and her team. So she's a relatively new researcher building up a big research group. This was published in Nature and Ecology and Evolution on June the 9th, 2026. So let's have a think about what we're looking at here. We talked about the Ediacaran before, but I think we should give everyone a refresher. What we're talking about here is the really interesting episode trying to deal with the origin of animals. Where did animals come from is a big, important evolutionary question. We've got not a lot happening in Earth for a long, long period of time, the so-called boring billion. And we've got the Cambrian explosion, where animals suddenly burst onto the scene with massive diversity of all sorts of animal phyla, as evidenced by the Burgess Shale, which we've talked about. But almost for a few tens of million years before the Cambrian explosion, we've got these tantalizing impressions of odd stuff happening. Proto-animals turning up. I hesitate to say proto-animals. That's a phylogenetically unsatisfying way of phrasing it. But we've got these interesting looking animals, which we talked about before in our beehive episode. And there was one other we talked about, the Ediacaran. I can't remember what was the other one we talked about with the Ediacaran.
Well, you talked about we've done a couple of episodes on whether Ediacaran things pop up in the Burgess Shale and vice versa, haven't we?
Yes, but now we're going right. We're getting much earlier into the Ediacaran then. So the Ediacaran sort of proto-animals are sort of split into three different zones or assemblages. One is, and we're going to focus on the first instance, on the earliest one of those, which is the Avalon. So that is I need some numbers on this to say how old it is, don't we? Let me look that up.
574 to 560 million years ago.
Okay, I didn't need to look it up. Susie's already got these numbers at her fingertips.
They're just in my head. Just in my head.
She's absolutely committed to these. So the Avalon is perhaps the bit of the Ediacaran that people might be familiar with already. We've got these sorts of slowly swaying fronds in the deep sea environment, looking a bit like seaweed, but actually they're animals. There's no movement at the beginning of of these animal Ediacarans of the Avalon. The things that move and look like coral reefs come along later on. Things that look a bit more like animals that we'd recognise.
Wait. The things that move and look like coral reefs. Coral reefs don't move.
Sorry, there was two separate categories I was talking about there.
There was a
yeah. Sorry, comma. Yes, absolutely right to point out. Sorry. Coral reefs aren't generally known for moving about. Yes, fair. So the question therefore becomes, what happens? Why is it that the things at the origin of animals happen in this order? That's an interesting question, right? I guess it makes some sort of Darwinian sense that we start out with the slightly less complex things and move to the more advanced things. But it's always been a really interesting question about why animals suddenly turn up, and what is it? What is behind this big leap? Did you have any? So you're a dinosaur person. How much did you think about this episode before I made you read this paper?
The big leap is the big leap. Are we saying the big leap is the origin of animals? Are we saying the big leap is the origin of going from things that are basically sessile, so not moving, so stuck to the seafloor, to things that are moving?
That's one of the reasons I want to ask you this question, I guess, because what does a dinosaur person think is the big leap? Is it, the fact that animals start out at the beginning, or is it that they start moving around having heads, or or do you just not care because it's too far removed from being a big scaly reptile?
Well, there's a tiny bit of that. No, that's not true. I mean, I think the thing is though that we have talked before about I've asked you, but how do we know these are animals? Why do you say they're animals? What's an animal? And actually, it turns out, I mean, I think either you've dumbed it down. I mean, you've definitely dumbed it down for me, but also that it doesn't seem to be a totally straightforward answer.
Absolutely right. That's going to be a really big theme of this paper, is that when it comes to doing science in the Ediacaran, it's actually really difficult. Almost everything is hard because you're working with things that are unlike anything alive today, and you have to use really difficult and complicated ways to try and get a handle on what's going on. So whether it is or isn't animals argument involves so many different strains of evidence: chemistry, trace fossils, morphology, the growth. You have to piece this all together. The ecology as well. Are they photosynthesizing? Are they lichens? It's really, really hard. But I think they're generally accepted by the most part that these things are some sort of very early animal.
Yeah. So, but what I was going to say was, because of that ambiguity or that apparent that difficulty, to me, I feel like the big leap is moving, because it almost seems like, and I'm going to be wrong about this, obviously, but the definition of what an animal is not straightforward, whereas the definition of whether something was stuck to the seafloor or wasn't stuck to the seafloor, was moving around, is quite clear, and thus that, but also that then allows you to, I guess, spread much more widely. It allows you to occupy new environments. It probably drives diversity change, drives biodiversity, I would have thought, because you're moving to new niches and you can do new things more quickly, I guess. So I would have thought that moving is more significant than the origin of animals, even though that sounds
I think they're actually intertwined. When you come down to what the definition of an animal is, I can't remember if we talked about this in the podcast or not, but it actually gets really, really tricky, because if you're dealing with something like a sponge or a coral, these things don't have a brain. They just sit on the rock and they feed. But they are animals. They're not like fungi or plants. So what makes them animals? Well, there are two big things that make you an animal. One is that you have an extracellular matrix, which is you can move your cells around in your body in a sort of interesting way, which other animals can't do. Other organisms can't do, sorry. And then the other one is movement, that you might have some motile stage of your life cycle. So sponges, even though they just sit on a rock looking fairly brainless and dumb, they do have a stage where they are floating around using cilia to move about in a way that most things don't do. So movement is intrinsic to the whole story. But let's get back to the story with the Avalon thing. So Avalonia. So this is the period of time where we're talking mostly about Newfoundland, where we've got these lovely fossil occurrences, very famous, but also Charnwood Forest, where they were first discovered in Leicestershire. I don't think we talked about the Charnwood Forest very much on this, but I guess the story... Are you familiar with the story of Roger Mason and the discovery of Charnwood?
Reminds me.
So Roger Mason... it was widely thought in the 1950s that there was no possible way that animals existed before the Cambrian, right? The Cambrian was when this thing has got beginning. Roger Mason was a schoolboy. He went to Leicester, went in the forest and found one of these fronds, and it ended up being called Charnia masoni after him. And, a schoolboy discovers it. He convinced his teacher. Excellent. That was the story for a long time. But actually, someone's been written out of this story. Can you guess who it is? It's a woman. Of course, it's a woman.
Oh!
So Tina Negus, who I was doing some background reading on this, was actually another school child, but a girl. And she was really into fossils, and she was trying to study them in secret from her parents. And she convinced her parents to go on holiday to Charnwood Forest by saying that she wanted to go and look at the flowers and the bugs and things like that. But actually, she was secretly on a mission to go and find the fossils. And then she went and found them, and then she was telling people, but no one would listen to her because, she's just a girl and she didn't have the connections. And her A-level teacher said, no, you can't do geology. You're not allowed to. You should go and do botany instead, because botany was a very more, a ladylike activity to go be doing. Anyway, she's, for a lot of people's actions, she's now reintroduced to the story. I'm not the first person to have mentioned this. This is, and people now popularizing that story to make, but it also, I guess, it's not an unusual story for a woman to have written out the history of science. We know this to be true.
We do.
Anyway, these fossils. So what we're dealing with is these flat surfaces with the animals sort of preserved as they were in life. So this is quite an unusual way, but it allows you to have lots of different insights in ecology. With the dinosaurs or the fish that Susie and I might go and dig up, often they might be in some sort of river channel or a cave deposit or something, and we go out and might extract the bones, and we might have to think about, whether or not they were transported there, whether or not it's been eroded. But these guys are preserved exactly in the position they lived and died. So we're looking at a flat, two-dimensional surface, and in Newfoundland it's amazing. I've not been there, but I've seen the footage and people talking about it. You've got these outcrops right by the sea, and you can go and stand on the precise surface, this deep sea surface where these animals were doing their business. So what Emily's...
If I was writing this paper, right, I would have put a picture of that in there.
That's a good point. I've seen Emily give talks, and she's uploaded, quite dynamic, examples of her doing all this laser scanning of the surfaces and action shots of her with the sea foam whipping up at her as she's doing it. But that's not. I guess we've got lots of graphs instead. It's time to get graphy.
Yeah.
So what that position means is that you can therefore look at the position of the organisms in their ecosystem, and you can do all sorts of maths to try and reconstruct their ecology, which is the point of this, is what this paper's about. Specifically about the origin of sex and sexual reproduction. So when we're talking about sex here, we're talking about whether or not you have sort of males and females, not necessarily males and females, because there's lots of different ways of doing this. This is why this is going to get awkward. The sweat is dripping off my brow again because of the heat here, not because this is getting too steamy and X-rated. But we're talking about two individuals. As an animal, you face a choice. A choice is the wrong way. In terms of reproduction strategy, you might be asexual. You might not have any sex. You might just bud off and grow and grow and grow and grow. And there are animals that do that. There are not very many of them, but they do that. Or you might make the choice where you share your genetic information with another individual, and then rather than your offspring just being all 100% your genome, you've now taken 50% of your genome and 50% of someone else's, and you've mixed that up and you've made something new. That's basically the sexual reproduction. Now, is this too X-rated for you? Question.
No, so I've got an interesting. It's not related at all. Very tangentially related factoid that I read in a book once. I can't remember what book it was. I think it was Almost Like a Whale by Steve Jones. I'm going to say that. I think in that book.
Yeah, I read it when I was a kid.
It's quite old now. When it's good. Yeah, exactly. And I think he had quite a range of sex-based and penis-based facts. He had like a really good. It was quite quality. And one of them was that slugs north of Chester only ever mate with themselves. I think it was north of Chester. It was like there's like a line somewhere in the country that's in the north, and basically it's too cold, so that they don't come across very many other slugs. So they only ever mate with themselves because they're like hermaphrodites, right? So they have both. I want to return
back to that point. I'd had if I read that book when I was 15. Let's return back to your snail point later on, because it may come up towards the end of this paper.
Oh, really? Yeah. How exciting.
So this is a really big evolutionary question, right? Why have sex, I guess? Because it's quite expensive, right? If you think about maximizing the ability to have... Okay, goodness.
Maybe it is for you.
I didn't intend to... Oh, no. This is going to be a train wreck, this episode. Right,
Is it metabolically expensive or physiologically expensive? Genetically expensive.
Because
just to be clear,
sexually, right, and you have 100 offspring, those 100 offspring all have 100% of your genome. If you reproduce sexually, you're halving the amount of your genetic information that you're passing on, and you're sharing it with someone else. Yeah. So that is a really interesting evolutionary question, because if you're being selfish, you would want to maximize your own amount of your genome that goes on. Evolution should squash that quite quickly. So why is sexual reproduction so common? Again, goodness.
It sort of makes sense when you're a human, right? Because you've got to have someone to take the bins out.
Okay, that's the priority here. I don't know how many bins were getting taken out on this Ediacaran flat surface.
Just so there's a benefit.
Right. I hope your husband listens to this episode and realizes that's his entire purpose. Not to help you rear the children or share your life together. No, to take the bins out.
Take the bins out and reach the stuff from the really high shelves. Yeah. Get the spiders out of the bathroom. All those sorts of things. Right. No, this is. But for an Avalonian sessile benthic organism. I don't see the need.
So let's go back to these benthic Avalonian. Since he's wiping the tears.
I am actually crying.
Right, going back to this sessile Avalonian seabed, right? We can reconstruct where they were doing. And Emily's had a paper about this a while ago where she demonstrated that a lot of them were reproducing asexually. So she was able to demonstrate by looking at their mapped distribution using maths that they sort of turn up in sort of clusters, and then those clusters have a ring of clusters around them, and then those smaller clusters have a ring of clusters. And that makes sense if you think about them having a stolon. So that's like a small tube or sort of way of branching out. And indeed, since then,
Yeah, so this was word
yes,
number one that
stolon, yeah.
I didn't know what it meant in this paper. Yeah,
So it's
stolon.
just like a
Okay.
little tube. If you imagine like an organism growing on a flat surface, then it might have a little tube reaching out, and then another one grows from that, and then another tube reaching out.
Popping
out
up.
there. That's the stoloniferous reproduction. So
So is this different from being a colony, like a bryozoan
it's
or a
similar
coral
to
or
well,
something?
bryozoans a bit difficult because they're actually a load of individuals in one colony. But a colony might be the right word, because if you have all these stolons going between them, then you can share resources. You might even,
Yeah.
at that point, you have to ask yourself what actually is an individual. If you have a series of
Yeah.
fronds or like leafy looking things sticking up, and you're all independently doing your filter feeding or whatever, or digesting the mat that you sat on, and you're all linked with a tube, then maybe you're just one big super organism, really.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like a
bit
tree.
like a tree.
All of the individual leaves are photosynthesizing
Well, some
individually, aren't they?
forests are like that. Some forests are connected into
Yeah.
one big tree. Lots of fungi do that. Lots of fungi have stolons that are
Yeah.
not stolons, but hyphae that stretch out across a long way.
They have the
Yeah,
mycorrhizal network, don't
mycorrhizal
they?
network. There we go. Yes. So, and also we've actually now found. I say we. They have found some fossil evidence to demonstrate these stolons. So it's not they were sort of identified as the way they were reproducing. So a lot of these ones on this early stage are asexually reproducing. But what Emily set out to do in this paper is to test the hypothesis of whether or not there's competition between them, and how you can map that competition, and how that competition interacts with the presence or absence of sexual reproduction. So that's quite an ambitious aim, and this is where the maths get a bit funky. So the main thing that they're trying to test is this heteromyopia idea. So heteromyopia is a phrase that I hadn't come across before I read this paper. It's the idea that you are more in competition with members of a different species than with members of your own species. So if you look around, it's like being short-sighted in the sense that you're being short-sighted. The way that you view the distance of a competitor depends on whether they are a member of your species or not of your species. And of course, that makes a difference. If you're sharing resources with members of your own species through this stoloniferous network, then yeah, you probably make sense that you're not in competition as much with other. And again, that also makes sense from a sort of kin selection kind of idea, in the sense that I probably want to cooperate more with my own species than other members of different species. But then again, maybe it doesn't. Anyway, that's the point. Whew, right, that's concept number one. We've got nailed down. This is what. Now we're going to get complicated after we've already got this down. Are we happy so far?
Yeah, that's good, because heteromyopia was the second word in this I didn't understand. And at this point, I got to a point where I had two words which I didn't know what they meant, and they were being used a lot.
Okay. Well, the next one is we're going to start thinking about isotropy, I think. So again, I can't really define that, but I'm going to come up with a more loose term to look at this. So what I should actually explain what the methods they did. We haven't actually got that far. So what Emily and her team have been doing for ages is mapping these surfaces. So they've got this enormous database where they've got the two-dimensional plots of lots of surfaces, and later on they reveal that they've plotted 76% of all the Ediacaran fossils. So that's
Wow.
Maybe I've misread that statistic.
Lot.
But it seemed like a lot. Basically, they've got a big data set of these flat surfaces. Hang on, let me find the sentence. Our data are a good representation of Avalonian life communities because we include 76% of documented species from the Avalon. So, okay, 76% of species, not 70% of surfaces, sorry. 46% of documented species with. So basically, it's a big forest sample with lots of maps of these surfaces. And then they can plot those clusters, their positions on this two-dimensional space. And then they've done a second thing. So they did that to map asexual reproduction, but they've done a second thing of trying to think about whether or not they were drifting off into space. How are they, if they're having a sexual reproduction stage, then they might, distribute some eggs or spores or something off into the distance.
So that's if they've had sexual reproduction, you get spores.
Potentially, yeah. So
right?
That's the idea, yeah.
Yes, sorry. You said if they had asexual reproduction stage, and I couldn't tell whether it was asexual or
asexual. There's going to be
sexual. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for bringing me up on that. Okay, so this is a way to try and get an idea that we might be able to identify. Basically, I don't want to get too bogged down in the detail, but the point is they're mapping out these things and trying to identify where there's competition, and when they are having asexual reproduction, and when they might be having more sexual type reproduction. So that's when they did this investigation using maths I don't understand to look at the isotropy to talk about the directional spread of the clusters. So are they spread out in a line, which might be aligned with the sort of ocean currents or whatever, or are they more random and sort of grouped? So
what would we expect if there was
yeah,
ocean currents that were like blowing spores in a particular direction? Maybe you'd expect to see them
yeah,
spread
yes,
out along an ocean
absolutely in a
current or
line.
something
Yeah,
like that. Whereas if they're just sort of attached and randomly popping up by budding or
yes,
whatever, then on these what are they called,
stolen. Yeah,
stollen?
yeah,
No, that feels like a German
stolen. Yeah,
Christmas cake.
yeah.
Stollen. Okay. All right. Well, those things. Now I've got a really strange picture in my head. Anyway.
Oh no.
So you get these random
Yeah.
things popping up. They're going to be more
Yeah,
randomly oriented, right?
absolutely. You're absolutely
Is
right.
that the idea?
And indeed,
Okay.
they found a spread of that.
Okay.
The fractofucus, this is the one they've looked at before, where they demonstrated asexual reproduction, has no structure. They're spread out all randomly. Their clusters are everywhere. But two others, Bradgatia and Thectardis, are very directional. So they seem to be in a sort of idea that they might be having flow. They might be, spreading spores or something like that.
Sporing.
Yeah. Okay. But that's a hypothesis. But the point is, there's a big variation there. Then they started looking at the competition. Now, the maths of trying to look at where the competition is taking place is even more complicated. But, and again, I'm not going to attempt to explain it. But I think as far as I can get my head around it, it's based on the idea about the clusters. How far are you away from your competition? And are you more close? Are you clustered with ones that are in the same species? Or are you clustered with ones in a different species? And, what's the hierarchy of those clusters? That's the most succinct way I can think to explain that. Does that make rough sense, do you think?
Sure.
It says because you just want me to stop talking about maths.
No, I mean, I think I don't know whether it makes sense because I haven't read the paper.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, okay. Well, I think we should just accept
so
it.
they did find 5 cases of interspecific segregation on small scale. So they found some cases where there was a range of different amounts of competition, and they found some cases where there was significant competition between the species but not within the species. So
you might expect that to indicate more asexual reproduction.
Well, that's what they're going to test. That's the hypothesis. That's the one we're trying to get to.
Okay, sorry.
But you're right. Well, this is. I mean, it depends on. That's the heteromyopia, right? That's the idea that you're avoiding members or in competition with members of different species more so than you are of your own species. That implies.
So you might be further away from them.
Members of different species, yes. The distances and the segregation. There's sort of structure is what the point is. There's some sort of way that members of different species and the same species are interacting in a different way. And this was an answer to your question. This was correlated with the presence or absence of this isotropy, or what they might interpret as the sexual reproduction. So this is quote, we found an association between the cluster directionality, which is the isotropy, and the presence or absence of intraspecific regularity, suggesting that stoloniferous reproduction inhibits the presence of intraspecific competition. So when you have asexual reproduction, when you're working in a team and doing this stoloniferous thing, you're not competing with members of your own species. That's what's going on there. And that's probably the main conclusion. So we might need to land on that for a bit longer, right? So just make sure that's absolutely locked in, because it is a bit complicated.
So what they found evidence to show that when you are reproducing asexually, you're competing more with different species rather than your own species for resources.
I think so, if I've understood it correctly.
Okay.
We should have got Emily on for this one. Okay.
We could have just chosen an easy paper. No, Rob.
No. But that's because we haven't yet got to the interesting point yet, because that's the main conclusion. But the implications of this are quite interesting, because then that means big implications about what's going on about evolution. And we'll get back to your comment about the snails. But before we do that, this is the bit that if we think about the caveats here, they then go through the different circumstances that might explain the heteromyopia. What could lead to this pattern? Number one is that they've got stoloniferous clusters. So that's, asexual reproduction and members of the same species sharing resources. That might lead to that. That's the heteromyopia. And that's the conclusion they lean into. There are other possibilities. So that would be pathogens or predators. Maybe you're sort of clustering to hide from some sort of activity going on. but they say they don't find evidence of that. Now, I'm a bit nervous about that, because I'm not sure we would find evidence of that necessarily. There could be all sorts of things floating around that we wouldn't find evidence of, but we'll move on. So there might be some sort of...
But we do
Go
think
ahead.
at this time that stuff really isn't floating
Yes.
around, right? That our
Yes.
communities are almost entirely
Yes.
sessile and benthic.
Yeah, I
or
think it's a
entirely sessile
fair
and
idea
benthic.
to come to that conclusion. But absence of evidence, evidence of absence, is not quite the same thing, is it?
It's not quite the same, but yeah, well, given the amount of research that's been done on these things and these communities, you think if there were some predators out there, they might have found one.
Yeah, but if you were like if you were a swimming predator, we'd have no record of you in the Ediacaran style preservation.
No, I suppose so. But possibly.
The Ediacaran only records the things that
yeah.
are living on the surface because of the particular mode of preservation. If you're a floating thing, we won't know anything about you.
Right.
But maybe I'm being unfair there, because as you pointed out, there's been an awful lot of studies here and an awful lot of investigation of these things, and things were barely even moving. So the idea that there was some motile predator swimming around is unlikely. So that's fair. We'll allow that. The other one is allelopathic death, which I had to sort of consider what that means. That means if you might have some sort of chemicals leaching out of you when you die, or some sort of chemical transmission that means that you form clustering, which again makes sense, because there could be all sorts of, if you think about the way fungi work, there's all sorts of interesting things going on where they have all these sorts of things in the soil that mean they interact or compete or work together.
I don't get it.
Yeah, I'm not explaining it very well because I don't really get it myself. But the point is, if you imagine a static organism sat on a surface, there could be all sorts of, and it dies. Or even when it's alive, there could be all sorts of chemical gradients that might say, stay away from this area, or this is my zone, whatever, things that you wouldn't see necessarily. But also, if you died, maybe you'd leave behind a sort of horrible pattern where everyone will go, oh, not there. And that sort of thing happens with animals quite often, you know. Well, not often, but you know what I mean. If you go to a site where an animal has died, you know, you might see has some sort of discoloration on the ground or whatever. But we're dealing with static things that don't move, so that makes it a bit more complicated.
Well, you could imagine your little fructus or whatever they're called going, oh no, that was Dave's spot.
Dave died.
Dave
That's
died.
not a good spot.
Sorry, you've got to. You've got to just leave, Dave. You just got to leave it. Too soon. Don't go there yet.
And the other one is niche segregation, but we're not going to go into that because we've already gotten too complicated. So they land on but the point is that's quite a linchpin of the arguments of the way it goes next, is that they land on this stoloniferous reproduction and asexual reproduction. Okay, so that's the caveat there, but let's allow that. Let's move forward. So this has big evolutionary implications, because the presence or absence of, you know, sex and competition is really what is going to be a core part of most evolutionary studies. Like evolutionary biologists spend a long time thinking about sex, genitals, sperm, because these are the sorts of they do, don't they? That's because these are the mechanics of evolution, right? That's if you want to.
It's because these are the sorts of people that they are.
Well, you're at the Natural History Museum, right? You must have lots of people there around that look at fly genitals and the like.
I'm certain we do, but nobody ever sees them because of the sort of people that they are.
So they go on to make some interpretations of this into the more broader context. So overall, they suggest, quote, a lack of selection pressure for most of the Avalonian taxa, end quote, and that this may mean a relatively lower diversification. So their implication is that as the environment changes through time, you see more sexual reproduction, and that's when you see this step change in the bigger diversification. So this is where the headline of the paper is that they're saying that when there was a step change after the Avalonian into like the White Sea assemblage and the Nambra assemblage, where you get more things moving around, it gets a lot more diverse, and there's a lot more sexual reproduction. That maybe the reason...
How do we know there's more sexual reproduction then?
Oh, because of...
Have people studied
because
that?
of the implications of what they're saying with the absence of the stoloniferous reproduction. So
the assemblages that came later. So the Avalonian is the oldest, and then there's the Nama, and then there's the White Sea. So in the Nama and the White Sea, have people previously studied? Have people previously said there's more sexual reproduction, or is that an implication of this study?
I couldn't tell off the top of my head, but it's more an implication, I think. But they have the same sort of preservation, so that should be doable. But this study is mostly based on the Avalonian ones, if I recall correctly. Oh, that's because they also did some modelling.
So,
no, I forgot the bit they did with the modelling as well. That came later on. They did some evolutionary modelling where they took some sort of parameters and sort of made a sort of White Sea assemblage type model, and they made a Avalonian type model, and they put in the presence or absence of different kinds of sexual reproduction, and it was all in accordance with how it works. So I guess that wasn't direct evidence from the fossils from those periods of time, but taking all the evidence together, what was going on in the Avalonian, the correlation between the sexual reproduction and the competition, and the modelling that they did, where they tried to make some sort of digital idea of what was going on in a computer, trying to predict what's going on. I think that's the story, if I've understood it correctly. So let's tie this together then. So it's not just the modelling, it's not just the fossil patterns, but it's also the changing in the environments and also the maturity. I didn't mention the ages of the specimens. They also consider how mature the ages are by looking at the sizes.
Oh
of them.
yeah.
So let's do another quote from them. The deep sea Avalonian environment was relatively stable compared with the white sea shallow water environment with a more homogeneous background environment, and the death events that killed and preserved communities occurring around every 10 to 100 years, possibly every up to 1,000 years, rather than the much more frequently 2 or 3 times per year in the White Sea. So let's go back to what this means about sexual reproduction. We talked about it being very expensive. So what the conditions to have sexual reproduction as an advantage means that really you should be in a fast changing, moving environment. If you're in a nice stable environment, and then maybe it's okay just to reproduce. If I'm sitting in a stable environment, maybe it's okay to have 1,000 robs because being a rob works. But if the environment is changing all the time, or there's some diseases happening, I need to work fast against evolution. I can't just wait for that normal pattern. I need to bring in extra genes and alleles from other members of the community so that I might maximize the chance of success. So rather than generating 1,000 robs, I'm now generating a big diversity of different 1,000 children. Oh, this is a hellish nightmare. Just the thought of 1,000 children I need to look after is now scaring the hell out of me. But the point is that
Having just had a small argument with my daughter halfway through this podcast, I am absolutely in favour. Not in favour of 1,000
so maybe
children.
then having 1,000 children that are the same as you now have 1,000 children that are very different because they've got a different range of genetic information.
Oh my
so
God.
some of them may have more chances of success. And when you move into the different area in the Avalonian at the beginning, its deep sea environment is very slow changing, very stable. As you move up, you get this rapidly changing environment, and therefore having more sex makes more evolutionary sense potentially, in the sense that you've got more genetic diversity and a bigger diversification rate. So that's a really interesting evolutionary story potentially.
Okay, I'm a little confused.
Cool, go ahead. This is the most complex paper we've ever done, so I was expecting questions.
Okay. So, so the Avalon assemblage is a deep sea assemblage, whereas the White Sea is a shallower water. Is what in that quote. So, but also there's a temporal difference. So there's both an environmental and a temporal difference. I'm not sure my question relates to the sex thing so much as to the. So how do we know that it's? Could there do we think that there were shallow water assemblages during Avalonian time that had the same level of heterogeneity, the same like sexual reproduction going on?
Have I got a treat for you?
It was just we only
because there was a second bonus paper that I was potentially going to mention that directly answers that question. So roughly at the same time that this paper came out, but I'm going to come back to that. But I want to finish off before we move on to that paper. I should finish talking about this one.
Okay.
But you've asked a really important question, and I want to come to that. So let me finish it
because I'm a little bit. So let me tell you my thinking with that, because if this is I guess that the idea maybe inherent in this is that asexual reproduction came first and that sexual reproduction came after as environments got more complex, as ecosystems became more complex. Is that kind of what we're saying?
As things were changing more rapidly, stability or rapid change,
But rapid change from an environmental perspective, but both abiotic and biotic change, right? Like the more animals there are, the more competition there is, the more niches there are potentially. So everything's changing, not the environment. And so I can't remember what I was saying now. Anyway, but what I was wondering was, is it actually temporal? Is it a temporal difference or is it a environmental difference? Is it a deep sea difference versus shallow?
That's a really interesting question. So I'll come back to that in a minute, I guess. So I think that's important because at the moment we've got them quite intertwined. The ecological difference and the time difference are intertwined, as is the competition and sexual reproduction question. That's why I guess they've gone to the great lengths to do all this modelling and do all the maturity things, because then that talks about trying to unlock those different things. So their conclusions were that this stoloniferous, as in asexual reproduction, has a significant relationship with the presence and strength of intra-specific competition. So they demonstrate that. I'm pretty convinced by that. That they say that this dispersal limitation is probably the underlying source of the Avalonian heteromyopia. So the patterns and structures of these things on the rock is related to the fact that they're having different approaches to the way that they reproduce and go on about their business. And they go on to say that the effects of this stoloniferous asexual reproduction are sufficient to explain the trends in diversification. So that's the bit that picks up on your question, which is, can you extrapolate or divorce the evolutionary mechanics of what's going on, or is it completely intertwined that the ecology and the behavior are linked? Well, that's where this other bonus paper comes in. So this paper came out a few weeks before, just 2 weeks before, by Scott Evans and some other people, where they discovered a white sea assemblage type thing. So Ediacaran fossils high up in the Mackenzie Mountains of northwest Canada, but they found this white sea assemblage type thing, but they found it placed temporally in the Avalon. So this is mixing up the sort of the timeline and the ecology that you were just talking about. This is a direct challenge to that, right? So because this one has, this new fauna has Dickinsonia in it, that makes it the earliest Dickinsonia ever. And Dickinsonia was one of the ones that might have been sort of flopping about and moving, not just the fronds. So this means that the time frames get a bit mixed up. Now, that doesn't in any way discredit or disprove the point that Emily was making in her paper, because that was all about the evolutionary mechanics. What this does address is your question, is that have we got this strict time separation in the ecology? Well, actually, no. It looks like there might be a bit more mixed, but this is slowly
right,
piecing together the idea. Of course, the deep sea environments and the shallow water environments of the Ediacarans might have overlapped.
Interesting. Okay, and that maybe some of these, in these shallower water environments, there were animals that were moving around, but they just hadn't. They just didn't live in the deep water environment.
Quite possibly, that's going to be quite hard to prove or test. But yes, there could have been something going on. I mean, I guess it makes sense, right? Because the deep sea environment existed all the different time frames, and the shallow water environment existed in all the time frames. It's just we have quite a limited little tiny window into what was happening because the way the fossil record is so biased. Because this Ediacaran type of preservation is very, very, very specific and unusual, right? It's not a type of preservation you get after the Ediacaran, apart from a handful of cases. It requires a certain kind of thing that maybe isn't possible when you live in a more active, wormy world. And it also means you only get this very flat, two-dimensional surface. So it's a very, very specific thing, and you only get limited insights. But it broadens out that broader question, I guess. Is the exciting speculation station is... Okay, now it's time for us to start speculating. Speculation station. What do we think of do we think that the evolution of sex was an important part of this story and the changing environment, or how would we test it? What would you want to find out?
I'm a bit exhausted after this paper, Rob. I don't know. I mean, I'm struggling still slightly with this to disentangle all the elements of it.
It's complicated. It's really complicated.
And how they all fit together. It's quite a complicated story about what I'm not totally clear about what's been tested, what's been modelled, and what's been inferred as a result of the testing and the modelling. So it's a bit difficult. I understand the concept of more competition might drive sexual reproduction, or more heterogeneous environments might drive sexual reproduction. But it's
the pace. One of the things they inferred was it's the pace of change in the environment. So when we were talking about the deep sea environment, it was very stable, and it was they were only having these mass death assemblages every 100 or 1,000 years, whereas in the shallow water environment, it's every few years. So under those circumstances, you've got to be evolutionary tip top and ready to go to survive that. If it's a nice stable environment, you can just take your time and just asexually reproduce, and it's okay. That's what seems to match up there. But of course, this is why the Ediacaran area is so interesting, but also so difficult. It's so interesting because it's right at the beginning. So if you want to answer these big questions, you need to get into it. But it's so difficult because even just asking basic questions about ecology involves so many layers of complicated maths and hypothesis and counter-hypothesis that it means that life is hard to do as a researcher to try and do it.
But Rob, I don't get one thing. Oh, I suppose it's to do with because so they they already knew that these things, they already had evidence that these things were reproducing asexually because they have these clusters. And then presumably in the White Sea and Nama assemblages, in some way they think that those things are reproducing sexually. That was because of modelling, or they
didn't demonstrate that directly. But they did show that there was a diversity
No.
of things going on in the Avalon. And what I guess the novel thing for here is that they've demonstrated that the asexual reproduction is correlated with the competition. So the way that they're competing with each other and the presence and absence of the sexual reproduction are linked. That's the.
But have they also done that on the White Sea and the
not on
Nama
this paper.
assemblage? Yeah. So how do we know that they're not all asexually reproducing there as well?
Well, I think because we've seen
And that there's just the different patterns in competition.
Because of the model.
So they're using competition as a proxy for asexual reproduction.
No, they're two independent things that they're trying to test against each other. But they're both related to the clustering patterns on the surface. Ideally, yes, we'd like to do that same study with the White Sea and the Nama, but that might be a bit. I guess the important point is that they've demonstrated that there's a diversity of strategies going on in the Avalonian already. So, they can infer that those strategies were going on elsewhere, I guess.
So where were we going to get back to my slugs only mate with themselves?
Okay, so that boils down to this question about the changing in the environment. Now, I'm assuming, in order for this slugs mating north of Chester, I'm assuming it has to do with the changing environment and the stability of the environment.
Well, yeah, I thought it was to do with the coldness, but bearing in mind this is a factoid that I'm remembering from probably when I was 15 or 17 or something, I'm willing to be wrong about the exact details of the fact, and it might not be Chester, but there was a line somewhere in England. Are you Googling it?
I'm trying to Google it now,
He's
but I
Googling
think
it.
this may be...
He's asking ChatGPT.
I may not be able to get ChatGPT to give me an answer in the time that is necessary to record.
Do you
this.
think with climate change, maybe slugs will start mating with other slugs further north? Because they'll come into contact with more slugs.
Possibly. I'll go and find out that the slugs up north, like they're chips with gravy rather than dry, and that'll be a whole thing. As a transplant from the south of England to the north of England, I've got to tell you, the north is absolutely right about this. I'm not. If I'm to move back down south, I'm not going to be happy with my southern chippies.
Chips and gravy.
Gravy and your mushy
Really?
peas.
Oh, God. That's my response to that.
What? No, come on. Okay, listeners, I was unable to fact check Susie in real time, but I went and looked it up, and I think that the slug she's referring to is called Arian, which is the terrestrial slug common in the UK. It is a simultaneous hermaphrodite, so all the individuals have male and female bits, and they can have a mating where they end up jousting with each other, and then the decision is made about who's going to be the male and who's going to be the female in terms of the genetic makeup. But sometimes if the conditions aren't right for that, they can also choose to reproduce by self-mating. And that does seem to have some geographical pattern with the north and the south, but I'm trying to read some papers from the 80s that have done Alzheimer's studies, and I've got a bit confused, so I'm going to leave it at that. But there does seem to be some truth to it. So, what do we think our take-home messages are for this paper?
I have got absolutely no idea, Rob. I think my take-home message for this paper is, can we do an easier paper next time, please?
Well, this was an experiment to do a slightly more complicated one. But I thought it was a really interesting question about the origin of, animals and reproduction. And I guess what makes it nice is it hangs together as a story, I guess, is the way I see the take-home messages. Narratively, it makes sense. That if you've got a nice stable environment, then these guys are all reproducing asexually, and then time moves on and they need to diversify, and then animal diversity goes up because they start having more sexual reproduction.
Yeah.
But in order to do that, you need to do some difficulty with the maths and whatnot. I mean, I say difficult maths. It's not actually that complicated. It's a two-dimensional surface with organisms mapped out where they lived and died. And if you're used to that kind of, spatial techniques, I'm sure the techniques are very normal and usual. They're just perhaps a bit out of my range and your range. That doesn't necessarily make it complicated. All right, any other messages, Susie? You need a cigarette and a cup of tea after that, do you?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks, Susie. See everyone next time.
See you next time, Rob.
The Fossil Files was created by Robert Sansom and Susanna Maidman.
Fossil Files is a labour of love created in our spare time with no budget, so we really welcome any support you can provide us via our Patreon.
There you can access bonus content and join in the discussion by posting your own questions or even participate in live episodes.
In either case, we want to hear what you think. You can let us know what you thought about the topics we discussed or make suggestions for future papers in our social media channels.
You can find links to our Blue Sky, Instagram and YouTube channels on our website fossils.libsyn.com.